He thought she was poor, forgotten, someone he could humiliate with the simplest invitation, a bruise to her dignity. But then the roar of engines cut through the chatter of the wedding crowd, and heads turned toward a private jet touching down on the tarmac just beyond the manicured lawn. The whispers crescendoed when she stepped out, her posture confident, her face calm, far from broken. He had invited her to his wedding to put her in her place, to remind everyone that she was nothing. Yet when she arrived in that jet, something shifted so strongly that the atmosphere changed completely in that instant. How did a woman he dismissed as insignificant find the means to arrive with such triumph? Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. The groom, Robert, had believed his plan was flawless. By inviting his ex-wife Claire to his wedding, he thought he could put her humiliation on public display, mocking the woman he had abandoned when he no longer saw her as valuable. But what Robert never expected was the sight of Claire stepping out of a private jet, her presence alone shaking the confidence of everyone around him. That single moment left the crowd breathless. And now the questions that mattered most hung in the air. Why would Robert invite Claire at all, when every detail of her life had supposedly proved his superiority? How had Claire, the woman once described by neighbors as broke and discarded, managed to arrive in such grandeur? And what truly happened in that hall after her arrival that caused whispers of betrayal, power, and an unforgettable reckoning to spread far beyond the wedding itself? Claire had once believed in love more than in anything else. She was 23 when she met Robert, a man whose charm could fill a room, a man who seemed to promise the world to anyone who stood close enough to listen. She fell for his ambition, for the way he spoke about building a future that would be brighter than anything they had known before. Claire was not wealthy, nor did she carry the kind of social prestige that turned heads in their town. She was ordinary, a woman with quiet dreams and a heart that belonged fully to the man she married. And so, when Robert demanded sacrifices, when he asked her to abandon her own career aspirations and devote herself to supporting his climb, she agreed. She cooked, she managed their modest household, and she believed every word he spoke about the future they would share once his hard work finally paid off. For years, Claire was the silent architect of Robert's success, though she received no recognition for it. She budgeted every dollar when his business ventures failed, she took odd jobs that no one ever noticed, and she endured the whispers of neighbors who dismissed her as a woman who had settled for less. Robert's hunger for status only grew sharper with time. At first, he was tender, grateful even. But as the years passed, his charm twisted into cruelty. The same lips that once promised her the moon began to speak in cold criticisms, reminding her of what she lacked and of how far beneath him she truly was. To those who didn't know them closely, they seemed like an average couple finding their way. But inside their home, Claire was learning a bitter truth. Robert loved ambition, power, and wealth far more than he ever loved her. The final blow came when Robert decided he had found someone better, a younger woman with the kind of wealthy connections that Claire could never offer. He justified his betrayal by convincing himself and others that Claire had failed him, that she was an anchor holding him back from the glittering life he deserved. Their divorce was not just a legal separation, it was a public humiliation. Friends and acquaintances looked at Claire with pity, whispering about how she had been left behind, how she had nothing to her name, and how Robert had upgraded to someone worthy of his ambition. In the eyes of many, Claire was the poor ex-wife, a woman stripped of dignity and discarded by a man who believed she would never rise again. But what Robert and his circle of admirers never understood was that Claire possessed a strength they had underestimated all along. Though her heart was broken and her reputation scarred, she refused to disappear. In silence, away from the gossiping mouths and judgmental stares, Claire began to build a life that no one could have imagined. What appeared to be weakness was, in truth, a gathering storm of resilience, determination, and quiet triumph. She carried within her a secret no one yet knew. A secret that would one day roar to life in the form of a jet landing outside Robert's wedding. A moment that would make the world finally see the woman they had all dismissed too soon. When the day came for Robert and Clare to stand in court, the scales of power were already tipped heavily against her. Robert, with his polished suit and smug smile, stood tall as if the proceedings were merely a performance designed to show the world who he had become. Clare, quiet and composed, sat opposite him, listening as his lawyer painted her as a burden, someone who had contributed nothing of value to his life or his success. The very years she had sacrificed for him were turned against her, twisted into accusations of laziness and dependency. When the judge read out the settlement, leaving her with almost nothing, Robert leaned closer and delivered the words that would echo in her memory. "You'll never stand beside me in the same circles again." To him it was a final dismissal, proof that she was powerless, a forgotten footnote in his rise to social prominence. The cruelty did not end in the courtroom. Outside, whispers followed Clare wherever she went. Friends who once smiled in her presence now looked on with pity, some offering hollow sympathy, others avoiding her altogether. The story of Robert's triumph and Clare's supposed failure spread quickly through the town. To society, she became the poor ex-wife, a woman abandoned, pitied, and left behind. Some said she would never recover, that her life would fade into quiet obscurity while Robert moved on to greater things. Robert himself embraced this narrative, boasting in private gatherings about how he had traded up, how his new bride represented everything Clare was not: youth, wealth, and prestige. To him, Clare was a closed chapter, a symbol of his past struggles, and he believed with absolute certainty that she would never again threaten the polished image he had crafted for himself. Yet even in her darkest hours, Clare refused to crumble completely. She carried her humiliation with a dignity that puzzled those who mocked her. They saw only the surface: her empty bank account, her modest apartment, her absence from the glamorous circles she once entered by Robert's side. What they did not see was the flicker of determination in her eyes, the resolve quietly hardening inside her. Robert walked away from that courtroom convinced he had silenced her forever. But Clare was already imagining a different future, one she would carve out with her own hands. She would endure the whispers. She would endure the loneliness. And she would endure the sting of betrayal. Because she knew something Robert had overlooked entirely. Strength does not always shout in the moment. It often grows in silence, waiting for the right time to be revealed. As Robert stepped out of that courthouse, his face lit with victory, Clare watched him from behind, her expression unreadable. He thought he had ended her story, that he had written the final chapter of her life. But what he did not realize was that she was only beginning to write a new one. He walked away smugly, believing he had broken her spirit beyond repair. But he had no idea what she was building in silence. For months after the divorce, Clare lived quietly, almost invisibly. But the silence was not the silence of defeat. It was the quiet of strategy. With what little she had, she began searching for opportunities that others ignored. She took on work that appeared menial, roles that most dismissed as beneath them. But to Clare they were stepping stones, each one teaching her something new. She studied accounting while balancing 2 part-time jobs, taught herself about markets through borrowed library books, and spent countless nights at her small kitchen table, mapping out possibilities on scraps of paper. The same people who pitied her thought she was merely surviving. They didn't realize she was learning the rules of a game Robert had never bothered to teach her. And in time, she began to see how she could play that game better than anyone who had once underestimated her. It started with small investments, almost invisible to those around her. A modest stake in a struggling family-owned business. A cautious partnership with a neighbor whose online store seemed doomed to fail. Each choice was calculated, each risk carefully measured, and while some ventures faltered, Clare learned from every misstep. Her determination hardened into discipline. She did not need lavish parties or public applause. Her victories were measured in quiet numbers, climbing in accounts no one knew existed. The long nights that Robert had once mocked her for were now spent building strategies, learning contracts, and drafting plans. Over time, the woman they had called poor and abandoned was transforming into something none of them could have imagined. A businesswoman with vision, a leader with grit, a strategist with patience. Behind closed doors, Clare was building an empire brick by brick. Years passed, and Clare's efforts began to bear fruit. The small businesses she nurtured grew into regional players. The partnerships she formed expanded into networks that carried her influence across industries. By the time most of her critics had forgotten her name, Clare had already secured a quiet fortune hidden in plain sight. She no longer needed to prove herself to those who whispered about her. Their voices no longer mattered. What mattered was the legacy she was creating, the stability she was crafting, and the undeniable fact that she had risen from the ashes Robert had left her in. She remained out of the spotlight, her power cloaked in understatement, her wealth carefully guarded from the very circles that once mocked her. To the world she was invisible. To those who worked with her she was unstoppable. Then one evening, after returning from a meeting that had secured yet another lucrative deal, Clare opened her mailbox to find an envelope addressed in familiar handwriting. She studied it for a long time before breaking the seal. Inside lay an invitation, gilded and heavy, announcing the wedding of Robert. The man who had once stood in court and promised she would never again share his circles was now requesting her presence at the moment he believed would be his ultimate triumph. Clare sat at her desk, the corners of her mouth curling into a smile. For years she had stayed out of sight, but the time for silence had ended. With calm determination, she placed the invitation aside, picked up her phone, and gave her assistant a single instruction: book the jet. Robert had spent months planning his wedding with meticulous attention, not because of his love for the woman he was marrying, but because he wanted it to be a performance, a declaration to the world that he had finally arrived at the life he always believed he deserved. To his circle of friends, he spoke often about his plans, not with affection but with pride, boasting of the grand venue, the lavish decor, the wealthy guests who would be in attendance. Yet more than the bride herself, what seemed to excite Robert most was the chance to invite Clare. He relished the idea of her walking into a room filled with everything he had denied her, a space designed to make her feel small, insignificant, and erased. In one private conversation overheard by a colleague, Robert laughed as he said, "When she sees what real success looks like, maybe she'll finally disappear." Those who surrounded Robert either chuckled nervously or nodded in agreement, unwilling to challenge his cruelty. For them, his arrogance was nothing new. He had always sought to measure his worth by comparing himself to others, and now, humiliating Clare seemed to him the ultimate victory. The invitation he had ordered printed was no simple card. It was embossed, heavy, gilded with flourishes meant to symbolize wealth and prestige. Robert was confident that Clare, if she even dared to attend, would sit silently in a corner, watching as he paraded his new life in front of her. He pictured her discomfort, the sting of her supposed failure laid bare against the shining backdrop of his new marriage. What Robert never considered, however, was that Clare had already moved far beyond his reach, and that the invitation he intended as a dagger would become the very stage for her triumph. When Clare first held the invitation in her hands, she did not react with anger or grief. Instead, she studied it carefully, her face unreadable, and then set it down on the table beside her. She had no need to prove anything to Robert, yet the irony of his gesture was not lost on her. Years earlier, he had sworn she would never again stand in the same circles as him, yet now he had extended his hand, practically begging her to enter them once more, though only as a figure of mockery. For a long moment, Clare considered the weight of the paper, the arrogance hidden in its design, and the laughter that must have accompanied its sending. Then, with a calm resolve, she opened her calendar, circled the date of the wedding, and leaned back in her chair. She picked up her phone, dialed a familiar number, and when her assistant answered, she spoke 3 words with quiet certainty: "Book the jet." The day of Robert's wedding unfolded with the pomp and spectacle he had carefully designed. Guests in tailored suits and glittering gowns filled the grand venue, their laughter mingling with the music of the string quartet. Robert walked among them with a polished grin, his arm proudly linked with his new bride, a woman whose youth and wealth he believed elevated him into the higher circles he had always craved. Yet beneath his practiced smile lingered an anticipation he could not hide, for he was waiting for the moment Clare would appear, certain she would step timidly into the crowd and serve as nothing more than a shadow of his past. He imagined her seated quietly, surrounded by whispers, her presence confirming his triumph over her. It was in this smug certainty that Robert failed to notice the low, thunderous sound growing in the distance, a sound that silenced conversations and turned every head skyward. The rumble grew louder, vibrating through the ground, and the wedding guests streamed out to the edge of the property to catch sight of the approaching noise. Then, as if drawn from a scene no one could have invented, a sleek private jet descended gracefully from the clouds, wheels touching down with power and precision on the airstrip just beyond the estate's manicured gardens. Gasps rippled through the crowd, confusion etched across faces. Someone whispered, "Who is that?" while others shielded their eyes against the sun, straining to see who could possibly arrive in such dramatic fashion. Robert's smile faltered, his grip on his bride's hand tightening as unease crept into his chest. For the first time that day, the spotlight shifted away from him and onto the mystery unfolding in front of their eyes. The jet taxied closer, engines roaring with authority, before finally coming to a halt, where all could see. A hush fell over the gathering as the jet's door opened slowly. From the cabin, Clare appeared, stepping into view with a composure that radiated power. She wore elegance like armor, every detail of her appearance deliberate, her posture unyielding, her eyes steady as they scanned the stunned crowd. She was no longer the abandoned woman society had pitied, no longer the ex-wife mocked for her supposed poverty. The murmurs grew louder, guests whispering to one another in disbelief. "Is that Clare? And how is this possible?" Each step she took down the narrow staircase was slow, measured, almost cinematic, as though the universe itself had conspired to frame her entrance as a moment none of them would ever forget. By the time her heels touched the ground, the atmosphere of the wedding had shifted completely, the celebration overshadowed by her unexpected and commanding presence. Robert stood frozen, his face drained of its smugness, his pride unraveling in full view of his guests. His new bride, sensing the sudden fracture in the illusion they had built, clutched his arm nervously, her eyes darting toward the crowd now more focused on Clare than on the ceremony itself. In that instant, the grandeur Robert had sought for his wedding collapsed, replaced by whispers of awe and speculation about the woman he had once discarded. Clare, walking forward with her head held high, no longer carried the weight of humiliation he had planned for her. Instead, she radiated the undeniable truth of her transformation. The woman he thought poor and powerless had returned, and she had returned in triumph. The poor ex-wife was poor no longer. As Clare crossed the threshold into the glittering hall, the energy of the wedding shifted like a storm sweeping through calm waters. The chandeliers sparkled above, yet no light in that grand room was brighter than the attention drawn toward her. Robert's family, seated near the front, exchanged looks of disdain at first, their lips curling in sneers, eager to remind themselves and anyone listening that she was nothing more than a shadow of Robert's past. Yet the whispers spreading from table to table quickly eroded their confidence. Guests who moments earlier had been celebrating the new bride now turned their heads, leaning toward one another, murmuring about Clare's astonishing entrance in a private jet. The sneers gave way to uncertainty, then to unease, as realization dawned that she was not the woman they once pitied. She was something entirely different now, wealthy, composed, and undeniably powerful. The guests began to shift, their allegiances bending with the momentum of the moment. Some stood and crossed the room, eager to greet Clare, their voices dripping with sudden admiration. Old acquaintances who had once ignored her reached for her hand, as if contact alone might grant them favor. Even strangers, uncertain of her story but certain of her presence, sought her attention, fawning over her as though she were the guest of honor rather than the discarded ex-wife Robert had intended her to be. Robert's bride clung tighter to his arm, her painted smile trembling, her eyes darting toward the crowd that no longer cared for her gown, her jewels, or even her presence. Robert's jaw tightened as his careful image began to unravel before him. What had been designed as a showcase of his triumph was dissolving into a spectacle that left him struggling for control. In a desperate attempt to reclaim his dominance, Robert approached Clare with a smirk plastered across his face. His words were sharp, laced with the same cruelty he had once used in court to belittle her. He spoke loud enough for nearby guests to hear, his voice heavy with mockery, asking if she had borrowed the jet to impress the crowd, or if she had somehow stumbled into money she couldn't possibly manage. The room grew silent as all eyes turned toward Clare, waiting to see if she would falter beneath the weight of his taunts. But Clare did not flinch. She met his gaze with calm precision and, in a voice steady and clear, revealed a truth that shattered the smugness from his face. She announced that she was not merely a woman who had rebuilt her life. She was now the owner of the very company that funded his new wife's family business. The revelation struck the room like lightning. Gasps filled the air, followed by stunned silence as guests processed her words. The wealthy bride's complexion paled, her eyes wide with disbelief, as she realized her new position was tied directly to Clare's influence. Robert's smirk evaporated, leaving only a grim mask of shock as the weight of his ex-wife's triumph bore down on him in front of everyone he had hoped to impress. The family members who had once sneered now sat frozen, their expressions betraying panic, as they recognized how quickly the balance of power had shifted. The whispers turned into loud conversations, the atmosphere of the wedding dissolving into chaos as people marveled not at Robert's union, but at Clare's ascension. And yet, just when it seemed the room had absorbed the full shock of her return, Clare paused, her eyes sweeping across the crowd with deliberate calm. She had already turned Robert's day of triumph into a day of humiliation, but her composure suggested there was more to come. The tension grew unbearable, silence falling once again as every guest leaned forward, eager and afraid to hear what she would say next. And then, she dropped the real bombshell. The room was already trembling with shock when Clare raised her hand, signaling for silence. The murmurs tapered off, replaced by an anticipation so heavy that even the music ceased. She looked around the hall, her eyes calmly meeting the stares of the wealthy guests, the bride's trembling smile, and finally Robert himself, who now stood rigid, his carefully constructed facade collapsing before everyone. Clare's voice was steady, almost gentle, but every word carried weight. She spoke of the years she had been dismissed, of how humiliation had once been forced upon her, and of how she had chosen to build instead of break. Then, with the kind of composure that can only come from complete confidence, she announced that she had decided to make a donation, not in her own name but in the name of Robert and his new wife. The amount she declared was staggering, so vast it eclipsed the entire cost of their wedding, and then some. The effect was immediate and electrifying. Guests who had been whispering now erupted in applause, their cheers thundering through the hall, not for Robert and his bride but for Clare. Her generosity, delivered with grace, had turned their day of supposed triumph into a celebration of her power and resilience. Faces lit with admiration as people stood from their seats, clapping and even shouting her name, swept away by the sheer scale of what she had done. Robert stood motionless, his chest tight, his pride suffocating beneath the reality that the woman he had cast aside was not only wealthier but nobler, capable of transforming his own day into a monument to her strength. His bride, her hand still clutching his arm, felt the shift in the crowd as they looked past her entirely, realizing that she had not married into glory, but into humiliation, tethered to a man whose power had been eclipsed by the ex-wife he had mocked. At the family's table, Robert's mother sat frozen, her lips parted but no words coming forth. This was the same woman who had once ordered Clare away, insisting she had no place among them, that she was too poor, too ordinary, too unworthy to ever stand beside her son. Now, before her very eyes, the woman she had dismissed had risen so high that no insult could touch her. Her silence betrayed the depth of her shock, the realization that her judgment had been wrong, devastatingly wrong. Around her, the crowd celebrated Clare as though she were the true bride of the day, the true figure to honor, and no protest from Robert's mother could silence their voices. The grandeur Robert had so carefully planned had dissolved completely, swallowed by Clare's generosity and her unshakable presence. What was meant to be Robert's crowning moment had transformed into Clare's undeniable victory. And as she stood there, watching the guests cheer her name, Clare did not gloat. Her smile was calm, her eyes steady, and her words humble. She had not needed revenge in the form of cruelty. Her strength was enough. By giving in their names, she had forever tied Robert and his new wife to a legacy of her making, ensuring that no matter where they went or what they did, they would live under the shadow of her triumph. The humiliation was not in what she said, but in what she had become. The woman they all believed would vanish had instead returned greater than anyone could have imagined. And in that hall, filled with applause and awe, Clare stood as living proof that resilience is the greatest weapon of all. The applause eventually softened, but the memory of what had just happened would linger forever in that hall. Clare, the woman once dismissed as poor and forgotten, had turned Robert's day of pride into a lesson that none of them could ignore. They had invited her to shame her, to make her small, to remind her of the place they believed she belonged. Instead, they left exposed, their arrogance shattered beneath the weight of her composure and her undeniable success. Betrayal had once threatened to break her, but instead it became the foundation on which she built her strength. Clare's triumph was not loud or cruel. It was calm, steady, and unstoppable. Every cheer from the guests, every stunned silence from Robert's family, and every nervous glance from his new bride only confirmed the truth. She had not been erased. She had risen beyond them all. As the evening drew to a close, Clare did not linger to bask in the spectacle. She had no need to gloat or to drag out Robert's humiliation further. With quiet dignity, she excused herself, walking past rows of guests who parted as though making way for royalty. Heads bowed slightly, hands reached out to shake hers, and voices whispered words of respect and admiration. Even those who had once mocked her could not help but marvel at the transformation they had witnessed. Robert, standing stiff beside his bride, watched helplessly as the very crowd he had sought to impress turned their loyalty toward the woman he had scorned. His defeat was not in her words, but in the undeniable proof that he no longer mattered in the story that was unfolding. Outside, the night air was cool and still, a sharp contrast to the storm of emotions inside the hall. Clare walked steadily across the grounds, her steps illuminated by the soft glow of lanterns and the eyes of those who followed at a distance, unable to look away. At the edge of the estate, her private jet waited, engines humming softly, as if in sync with her heartbeat. The very symbol of the power Robert had tried to deny her now stood as a testament to her journey, the vessel that would carry her away from the scene of her greatest vindication. With grace, she ascended the stairs, pausing briefly at the top to take one last look at the glittering venue behind her, the place where her past and her future had collided in unforgettable fashion. And as the door of the jet closed and the engines roared to life, the reflection of her story became clear. They had once believed they could break her with betrayal, that humiliation would define her. Instead, betrayal had become the spark that ignited her rise, the quiet fuel for the empire she had built in silence. Clare's departure from the wedding was not an escape, but a declaration, a reminder that dignity is more powerful than cruelty, and that resilience will always outlast arrogance. The jet lifted into the night sky, its lights piercing the darkness, carrying her far from the life she had once endured. In that final wide shot, Clare was not just leaving Robert and his new wife behind. She was leaving behind every whisper, every judgment, every scar of the past, carrying only her strength into the future. And so, the night ended not with Robert's triumph but with Clare's undeniable victory. A victory written not in arrogance but in dignity and strength. For years he had told her she was nothing, that she would never again stand in the same circles as him. But on the day he meant to humiliate her, Clare reminded him and everyone else that true worth is not measured in cruelty, but in resilience. They invited her to be shamed, and instead, she left them exposed. Robert, his bride, and his mother would never forget the moment the woman they called poor proved she was richer in every way that mattered. Now, a question remains for you, the listener. If you were in Clare's shoes, would you have gone to the wedding standing boldly in the very place meant to break you? Or would you have stayed away, letting silence serve as your answer? Let us know in the comments. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming real-life stories of betrayal and redemption. Because if you think this story was shocking, if you think Robert's downfall and Clare's rise was the most unforgettable twist you could imagine, wait until you hear what happened to the husband who left his wife alone in a hospital bed on the day she needed him most, only to regret that decision for the rest of his life. That is a story of betrayal, justice, and consequences so profound it will leave you questioning the very meaning of loyalty. Stay with us, because the stories of heartbreak and resilience are far from over, and each one carries a truth about the human spirit you won't want to miss.